Hello. It's both a pleasure and an honor to be here. I'd like to talk a little bit about something that really, in a way, changed my life, which was my experience in Rwanda in 1994. I often say that my life can be divided before and after the Rwanda genocide. But before I say a few words about the genocide, let me say a couple of things about my parents. The Second World War was the biggest event in my life that I did not take part of. I was born 9 years after the silencing of the guns and the closing down of the extermination camps. My parents, though, by 1939, were young teenagers. My father, Marcus, came from a place called Zawiercie in southern Poland, and mother, Musia, came from Vilnius, Lithuania. They had happy, carefree childhoods, but the war really changed everything. They were, of course, taken to concentration camps and extermination camps, and they both developed a very strong doubt about governments, politicians, and diplomats, for obvious reasons. They really thought that the world failed them, which it did. By the end of the war, they made their way into Rome, Cinecittà to be more precise, which is the Rome Film Studios, which then was a camp for stateless citizens. They met in Cinecittà, they fell in love, and they got married. And thanks to UN-issued travel documents, they immigrated to Brazil, where I was born. And in spite of all the bitterness that the war brought to everyone who survived, my parents were very, very positive. They didn't bear grudges. They didn't want revenge. They just want justice. That's what they wanted. And they realized that what moves the world are things like solidarity and support, rather than hatred. And they really worked hard to pass that on to me and my brother. By late 1990, I was invited to work at the United Nations in New York as a television producer. I ended up retiring from the UN as chief of United Nations Television in New York. I served for 26 years. The UN in the early 1990s was really an incredible place to work. It probably still is now, but then it was pretty interesting because there was a time of transformation, major transformations going on worldwide. It was the end of the Cold War, so there was a lot of hope that the UN would finally be able to do what it's been created for in 1945, which was bringing development, peace, security, and human rights for everyone, everywhere. It was the end of the Soviet Union, so people thought that this bipolar world was going to cease. There was the first Iraqi war that brought a certain degree of consensus between a number of nations, and there was an idea that nations could come together and work towards a goal. At least it appeared at the time. The UN itself was sort of stepping out. It was a time of the creation of a number of peacekeeping missions in places where the Cold War had been fought pretty hotly and brutally. So there was peacekeeping missions going on throughout Central America, of course, many African countries, including Angola, Mozambique, Somalia, Rwanda, Cambodia. The UN was organizing these real big conferences, and just to name a few, the International Summit for Children, the World Conference on Women, and of course, the the Conference on Development and the Environment in Rio in '92. There's a lot of stuff going on. There was talk about reforming the Security Council and the organization as a whole, which is still being talked about today, and nothing happened. Just as importantly, in 1993, the General Assembly created the post of High Commission for Refugees. I'm sorry, High Commission for Human Rights, the first High Commissioner for Human Rights office. So that was a major, major sign of hope for all of us who believe that human rights is something that need to be respected. Then came Rwanda. I've been following Rwanda quite closely throughout the early 90s. As I said, there was a peacekeeping mission there. And I went to East Africa to do some films for the UN with the idea already that because of what was going on there, especially after April 6, when the plane carrying the presidents of Rwanda and Burundi was shot down in Kigali, I knew that something pretty horrific could happen. So I made my way to East Africa, basically to wait for the refugees and do stories about people leaving Rwanda. I was in Tanzania in early May, 94, and I got a phone call from headquarters in New York saying that I should go immediately to Nairobi and wait for instructions there, and I took the cameraman I was working with to Nairobi, and then Mr. Jose Ayala Lasso, who was in fact the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the first one, flew in with the idea that we would go to Rwanda and try to somehow diffuse the situation. I was very excited because for me it was a way to honor my parents, and it was a way to contribute towards something that I felt very, very strongly about it, i.e. putting an end on the genocide. What we found out, what we experienced upon arriving in Rwanda was something that I will never forget. It was horrifying. Our task was to shoot as many horrific images as possible in order to publicize what was going on and try somehow to get the international community to act upon it. That was what we tried to do. But nothing really prepared me to really deal with what I saw. I had war coverage experience, but this was a pretty incredible thing. There was no fear, no shame. The Rwanda genocide really impressed me for its transparency. It was really weird to be, it's hard even for me to describe how people, because people were being killed very openly on the streets. I mean, you're talking about children, women, men, the elderly. There was no shame. There was no, there was no shame. We, of course, in spite of all our efforts, failed miserably. The Rwanda genocide continued until June. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed. What's going on in Congo and the Great Lake regions still is a consequence of the genocide in Rwanda. We failed, the High Commission for Human Rights failed, the UN failed, especially the Security Council, and the world failed. Because in the end, something that my parents told me was that national interests are often more important for governments than humankind's interest. So we can never really forget that. It changed my entire perspective in life and in how I dealt with my children and how I dealt with other people. And I kind of committed myself to work towards trying to stop mass killings and genocide. And I can tell you that just saying no more is not enough. People really need to act upon. Diplomats hate to be hassled, so we have to hassle them in order to try to get somewhere. The same goes for politicians, for governments, multilateral organizations like the UN and the EU, the business community, the media. They all need to be put pressure on in order to act upon. And this acting upon includes civil disobedience and nonviolent acts, because that's the only way we're going to be able to make never again really happen, really never happen again. Because it will happen again, unless we stop it. We need to put a stop on mass killings and genocide. It's a shame for the human species to do that to one another. I just want to conclude by saying that upon leaving Rwanda, I called my parents to tell them where I was. Of course, I didn't tell them where I was going because they would have gone absolutely ballistic. But I picked up the phone and with tears in my eyes, I called my parents. They said, I finally understand. Thank you.